Okay guys, so this is a video that I'm not happy having to make, and that is basically what this title card says, which is that the Xbox One cannot use more than 2 terabytes of internal storage. Now there's a question mark on the end because I'm basing this video off of comments I've received from 3 different sources on people that have used 4 terabyte, 5 terabyte drives, basically drives larger than 2 terabytes, and they've tried to download or copy more than 2 terabytes worth of games to their newly installed internal drive and had run into issues. But first, let me say this is not something that I've been able to test for myself. I plan on doing that, and in a future video in the next week or two, I will do just this. I'll take a 5 terabyte system or a 4 terabyte system and copy 2 terabyte plus of games from an external drive to the internal drive and see what happens. But I'm kind of on a tight schedule lately. I have a lot of different things going on with my primary job and just life in general, and it's going to take me some time to actually get to that point where I can do a thorough test of this. But in the meantime, I figured I'd put together this quick video for you guys. Okay, so let's first look at our disk structure. So in terms of what the 6.1 Windows partitioning script or Linux partitioning script actually does, and how a drive larger than 2 terabytes differs than a 2 terabyte drive. So in this example here, we have disk 3 and disk 4. Disk 3 is a 5 terabyte disk, and disk 4 is a 1 terabyte disk, as you can see here on the left hand side. And what I did to get larger than 2 terabyte drives to function properly is to move user content, which is normally partition 2, to partition 5 on the larger disk. Now the reason I did this was that if you don't do this and basically you leave user content here and then resize it using the 4.5 gigabytes you have available on a 5 terabyte drive, these 3 partitions that follow it stop being recognized by the Xbox One, particularly the system update partition, the 4th partition, which has all your update files. If that partition is not seeable when your system boots up, or if it can't see the files on that partition, you'll usually get an E100 error of some sort. Usually I think it's E106, but it might be some variant of that. But basically that says that the system update partition is missing. To get around that, you move user content to the end of the disk, and then the Xbox One properly sees the partitions that precede it. And by all appearances, your internal storage has 4.5 terabytes of available space. So that's where we were up until this point. Now, I released some videos on actually how to do this process, and people have been doing the process. In the meantime, I've gotten some comments like the following. Okay, so this is a comment that I received, well, as you can see, a week ago. So I put a 5 terabyte drive into my Xbox One X. Everything seemed to be fine. I started copying the games, about 300 of them, from close to 5 terabyte worth, but less, as I wasn't copying all of them. And we'll skip ahead here a little bit. After about halfway through, the copying got stuck. Installation stopped for 200 items or so. I checked the internal storage, and it looked like it got stuck after filling up 2 terabytes worth of data. Is there a limitation to how much data you can have on the internal drive? Like, maybe there's no point to anything bigger than 2 terabyte if the system can't read more than 2 terabytes of data. Okay, and then he posted again shortly thereafter, I turned off my system and tried turning it back on, and now it errors and says something went wrong. Before I put the 5 terabyte drive in, I used, looks like, some program here to write the files to the whole drive and read them back to make sure reading and writing properly. Has anyone else ran into this problem? Okay, so I then commented that someone did, and I'll show you that comment in a little bit, but someone did mention they had a problem when they were copying all their files. But until I saw this, I didn't put 2 and 2 together, okay? So let's move on to the comment that I received yesterday. I don't know if anyone else has ever actually tried to fill a 5 terabyte drive, but I've discovered a nasty snag. As soon as you fill it over 2 terabyte, game installations stop. On the next boot, you'll get E105 error. Removing the drive and connecting it to a PC will show that the partitions are all raw. What this effectively means is that trying to use over 2 terabyte internally will result in corruption on unbootable console, even if the console sees more than 2 terabytes available of user space when you first set the disk up with the script. As he mentions, he went through the scenario twice, and for now it seems you're better off using 2 terabytes, basically what the other person said, which seems to be true. I commented back. What is sort of interesting here, or what is interesting here over what the other person said, is that when he put it into his PC after filling it up over 2 terabytes, that all the partitions showed up as raw. That'll be something we'll look into a little bit more. It's possible the Xbox One is corrupting them once you go over that space. It doesn't know what to do. Or it could be something else there. I'm not really sure. But again, it reinforces the fact that copying games over to your 5 terabyte drive, or it really doesn't matter in this case, it could be a 3 terabyte or 4 terabyte as well, results in an error. I'll show you one more comment here, and this is from the Game Complainers. He actually has been following along my channel for a long time and has commented on pretty much every video I've made. But he also upgraded to 4 terabytes. And it says here, he says his worked for about 4 days and crashed. He ran Crystal Disk Info, and the 4 terabyte came up fine. No idea what was going on. And then I asked him if he could, I told him some possibilities for the problem here. Such as overheating and other issues you might have with 4 terabyte drives, or issues I had with a 4 terabyte drive in the past. And he replies, I've been running it for 4 days straight, downloading my games. It stopped downloading with 26 games left out of 200. Dash was working, but the download just stopped. I rebooted and got an error, and the dash never loaded again. But this reinforces the first 2 comments. Basically, his difference was he downloaded the games to fill up the drive, whereas the other 2 people had copied their games from an external, which is what I'm actually going to do. My place of business blocks game websites, such as the Xbox website, so I can't actually download games here easily. I can use a VPN to do the downloads, but it's much slower when I do that. So I'm going to use an external drive instead. Anyway, so those 3 comments, basically I've gotten over the past week or so, have led me to believe that, first of all, having 3 people experience the exact same result seems more than a coincidence to me. So let's go on to some research that I've been doing. All right, so this got me thinking a bit about the 2 terabyte limit that we're running into here. Basically, with 32-bit operating systems, you can't use partition sizes beyond a 2 terabyte capacity. And there's an article that you're seeing here in front of you that is on the Microsoft support page that basically details what you need to do on your Windows system to support drives larger than 2 terabytes. And it starts off here, in order for an operating system to fully support storage devices that have capacities that exceed 2 terabytes, the device must be initialized using GUID, partition table, or GPT partitioning scheme. If you're familiar with my scripts at all, they've pointed out that the Xbox One does actually use GPT-DIS. This scheme supports addressing of the full range of storage capacity. If the user intends to start the computer from one of these large disks, the system's base firmware interface must be Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, or UEFI, and not BIOS. Okay, so in this particular case on the Xbox One, we assume we're using EFI as the system firmware, but we don't really know for sure. It may be some sort of custom thing. It seems pretty clear that it's not a BIOS, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Or in fact, I'll show you on the next couple slides why it's not using a BIOS. But it could be using a custom firmware, and again, I'll kind of explain why I think that is in just a little bit here. But in the rest of this document, well, first of all, I want to point out this document doesn't actually refer to Windows 10. The Xbox One is using Windows 10 as its base operating system. Anyways, let's go on to the next slide here. Now, it does give our requirements here for overall requirements for a bootable system volume, okay? So this is pretty significant. In the case of the Xbox One, it doesn't technically boot off the hard drive. It has a system NAND where the OS itself is actually stored, and then it uses the hard drive for caching files and storing games and profiles and stuff like that, and it requires that drive to exist. However, the actual operating system itself isn't actually on the disk, and this is evident in the troubleshoot menu video I did the other day, where you can access the troubleshoot menu without a hard drive being in a working state or with the actual OS files installed on the hard drive itself. To meet the conditions above, the prerequisites must apply. The disk must be initialized using GPT, and as you've seen in my script, the Xbox One hard drive is actually GPT. The system firmware must be UEFI. That is a little bit harder to confirm, although it seems likely given that all hardware these days is UEFI, including the Mac platform as well as most Windows computers now, although Windows computers can support BIOS and MBR boot partitions as well, or they continue to support legacy boot options, and I'll show you that in a little bit as well. Okay, next, the Windows version must be a 64-bit operating system, 64-bit only. Okay, and again, this article refers to only as high as Windows 7. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here. Here's another table that's kind of interesting, and I'm showing you the requirements to use a 2 terabyte drive, but you'll see this article seems to suggest that there may be issues with 2 terabyte drives still, even with the requirements shown here, which is where I think the Xbox One itself falls victim to. What we can see here is the BIOS versus UEFI versus MBR versus GPT. So in the case of the Xbox One, we have a GPT disk, and we think we have a UEFI BIOS. So we can see on Windows 7 through XP that a BIOS and MBR are fully supported, as you would expect. The next combination is the newer UEFI, which is a BIOS replacement, and GPT, which is the MBR replacement. And you can see that Windows 7 and Vista support it as long as you're using the 64-bit version of that OS. So the next table here is an interesting one too, because it talks about Windows support for a large capacity disk has non-boot data volumes. This table above that I just mentioned isn't necessarily referring to 2 terabyte disks specifically. It's just referring to BIOS and partitioning scheme combinations, or the system firmware and the disk partitioning scheme layouts. Okay, but this next table here refers to greater than 2 terabyte support, and I find it interesting that it says non-booting data volumes. Okay, almost as if to say you shouldn't be using a 2 terabyte disk has a booting volume. So if we look here on this list, we can see that greater than 2 terabyte single disk with MBR format, support for 2 terabytes of address capacity, supports up to. So if we're using larger than 2 terabyte disk and we're using MBR, we can't make partitions larger than 2 terabytes. I'm not really familiar with this, but I guess you could have a hybrid MBR. Again, I'm not sure what that is. Maybe that's, but I'm not sure. I'm not even going to speculate. But the last bit here is for larger than 2 terabyte single disk with GPT. And you can see in the case of Windows 7 and Vista, it supports the full capacity. With Windows XP, it doesn't. However, again, this is referring to non-bootable volumes, which could be okay again in our Xbox One case, considering I don't believe the Xbox One boots from that volume. However, because it winds up being disk 0, it may still fall victim to basically not fully supporting the capacity. So let's look at our last slide here in this particular article. And this is what I find kind of interesting. First, here's our last updated. So you can see this was last updated last year. So on some levels, this article is considered to still be relevant. So here we have known issues and limitations. Because of the transition to single disk capacity of greater than 2 terabytes has occurred fairly recently, Microsoft has investigated how Windows supports these large disks. The results reveal several issues that apply to all versions of Windows earlier than and including Windows 7 with Service Pack 1 and Windows Server 2008 R2 with Service Pack 1. To this point, the following incorrect behavior is known to occur when Windows handles single disk storage capacity of greater than 2 terabytes. So the first one here, the numeric capacity beyond 2 terabytes overflows. This results in the system being able to address only the capacity beyond 2 terabytes. For example, a 3 terabyte disk with available capacity may be only 1 terabyte. This is interesting here, this overflow bit. Clearly the Xbox One is not doing this, because what this basically means is if you throw a 2 terabyte disk in, you'll be able to see the final, or yeah, if you throw in a 3 terabyte disk rather, you'll be able to see the last 1 terabyte, but you won't see the beginning 2 terabytes. With the Xbox One, we seem to be having the exact opposite problem, where we're seeing the beginning 2 terabytes but not the end of the disk. So that leads us to number 2 here. The numeric capacity beyond 2 terabytes is truncated. This results in no more than 2 terabytes of addressable space. For example, a 3 terabyte disk, the available capacity may be only 2 terabytes. Now that bit is a bit interesting. It talks about the truncated space. I was able to format or create partitions beyond 2 terabytes when I had user content as the second partition, but when the Xbox One itself was trying to use the disk, it couldn't see that space. The workaround again was to move user content to the end of the disk. But now it appears that even though that partition is the end partition, as it goes beyond the 2 terabyte realm or space, that area of the disk doesn't seem to be usable by the Xbox One. So it seems to lend itself to that second bit there, in that we can basically allocate it, but we can't address it, if that makes any sense. So we can make it appear as if the space is there, but we can't actually use it. Okay, so I just wanted to show you this article really quick because it does seem to create a gray area of how well Windows supports 2 terabyte disks. Now I know, again, this doesn't refer to Windows 10 specifically, but if you have any experience or understand some of the underpinnings of Windows 10, the kernel that Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8, and Windows 10 uses is very similar. All right, let's move on to my next slide here. Okay, with that article in mind, and my having pointed out about 100 times here that it doesn't refer to Windows 10, I thought, why not take a 5 terabyte disk, throw it into a newer computer with using an UEFI BIOS, and install latest version of Windows 10 on it, and see if I can actually use that as disk 0 and create a large partition greater than 2 terabytes and fill it up. Okay, so that's exactly what I did. So you can see here, I took all these snapshots today. So here's our BIOS here in front of us. So you can just see I took this a little bit earlier in the evening today. Now this is a Dell Precision Tower 3620. In fact, it's one that I purchased about a month ago. And we can see our BIOS version, and again we can see the BIOS dates, which is kind of interesting. As you can see, they're all within basically the last month. And we have 8 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM. Okay, not all that interesting. Now this points out that this system is configured using UEFI. And we have the legacy boot options, basically support for MBR disabled and or BIOS emulation disabled. And we also have Windows on this system. Okay, again, this is just showing that I have the legacy boot ROMs disabled. And if you want, you can pause this and read what that basically means here. And I wanted to show one more slide on the BIOS where you can see here is our 5 gigabyte hard drive. You can see the BIOS sees it, no problem. At least it sees the serial number of the drive. Not necessarily that we can use it properly, but there we go. Okay, so I took about a day to install Windows 10 on it. And this is a single screenshot where I put basically all these different windows into one shot here so I could review it all in one screen here. The only thing that wasn't on the screen is this guy down here, and I'll get to that in a little bit. This is actually taken from a Xbox One, system information from an Xbox One. Okay, so let's start with disk management here at the top. So this is just showing disk 0 in this particular system, which is running Windows 10, has our 5 terabyte drive installed, and it created 3 partitions here. Now, if you right-click disk 0 and do properties, you'll get this window here. And I did this so that you could see the partition style of this drive is actually GPT. Okay, so similar to our Xbox One, we have more than one partition here. We don't have 5 partitions, but we do have 3 partitions. And not to get into this too much, but we have an EFI system partition here. I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand what it's for, but I can say the Xbox One drive doesn't have a partition like this, but this is very common on Windows 10 systems. The partition before that is the recovery partition. You'll actually see this on a lot of Windows systems. This goes back pretty far. I want to say from at least Vista on. And this is basically a bit of Windows or an image of Windows that allows you to repair your C partition or your primary Windows partition when this particular partition becomes unbootable. Again, this is not something that's present on the Xbox One. But here's our C drive. So this is where we actually have Windows 10 installed. And as you can see, it's about 4.5 terabytes in size. Now we come down here, and basically what I wanted to show you was the Windows 10 version itself. You can see here is our 8 gigs of RAM. We're running it as a 64-bit OS. So again, we're meeting all our requirements here. We have a system that has the BIOS, or has the system firmware, is UEFI. And the primary boot disk is GPT, and the operating system is a 64-bit operating system. So we meet all the requirements of using a disk larger than 2 terabytes. In this case, it's a 5 terabyte drive, and it's disk 0. And again here, this is when you run the winver command, and I just wanted to show you that it's got the 1709, so the September 2017 build of Windows 10, and the actual build number is here. And if you look in a command prompt, you can see the Windows build version in a format that's more similar to the way the Xbox One displays it. So if you go into settings on the Xbox One and look up system information, you'll basically see the OS version listed like this. And you can see that the latest version of Windows 10 and the latest version of Xbox One has a very similar version and build number. Only the last digit actually differs. And I'm pointing that out because this experiment here was basically to see if Windows 10 itself, even with everything as it was said in that article, doesn't allow you to use more than 2 terabytes, then that explains why the Xbox One is also having difficulty reading disks or utilizing disk space larger than 2 terabytes. So we come here to our last window, which is the experiment that I did, which is I copied 2.8 terabytes from a backup disk I had. I had a bunch of Xbox 360 disk images that I copied over, and I just wanted to go beyond 2 terabytes, and I easily did and further. And you can see, now we're down to, we have our 4.5 terabyte capacity here, and we easily went beyond the 2 terabytes, and the system works fine. I didn't get any errors during the copy process. It just did what I asked and used all the space. So this exercise, although it turned out to be futile, I wanted to at least see if Windows 10 could handle a disk 0 or boot volume that was larger than 2 terabytes and make use of that space. And as you can see with this particular build, it did work just fine. Okay, so here's our final slide here. And so our final slide is, again, that same Windows 10 installation. And what I decided to do was figure out, what I didn't show here was when I built that Windows 10 disk, I had it as a blank disk, unpartitioned, and let Windows 10 do all the partitioning. So all the partitioning that you saw in that slide, this slide here, this partitioning scheme, this was actually done by Windows 10 itself. It's not something that I manually did and then installed Windows 10 on it. Okay, figure that's worth pointing out. So I took some information from the partitions, specifically it says D here. That's because I actually took the drive and hooked it up to one of my other systems just so that I could easily analyze it. So it will be interesting to compare this with the disks or with the partitions that I've been generating for the Xbox One. Again, I imagine that all these parameters will be the same, but that remains to be seen. Okay, well, that should do it. So unfortunately, it does appear that, at least for right now, that using a drive larger than 2 terabytes doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I wanted to get this video out there because I'm trying to limit. I know a lot of you have already gone out and purchased a larger drive to use in your Xbox One. And unfortunately, I have to point out to you that you could run into trouble if you ever get beyond that 2 terabyte region of the disk, or if you wind up storing more than 2 terabytes of data, you're going to wind up running into some trouble. So I figured this is important to point out to people as soon as possible. I'm going to have to go back and put some warnings on some of my past videos. And on top of that, I'm going to have to update the partitioning script to put warnings in as well. I'm hoping that I might be able to get around this problem, but the likelihood of that happening is pretty low given the fact what I pointed out before is we don't really fully understand the Xbox One hardware. So it's going to be difficult, aside from doing something different with how I'm formatting the drive, to resolve this issue if the Xbox One itself just is built to not be able to handle the or be able to address these larger than 2 terabyte disks properly. It could just be built into the system NAND, firmware, OS, whatever you want to call it. It might just be built or hard-coded into that part of the Xbox One, and maybe something that's never unlocked. So this only seems to point to the fact that there will probably never be an Xbox One that ships with a larger than 2 terabyte drive. And again, that's okay because you can use external drives, and they support external drives up to 16 terabytes. So, that is fine, as many people have pointed out. And in a lot of cases, that's a better solution for most people because you don't have to open your Xbox One, and you don't have to risk voiding your warranty, and you don't have to risk damaging your system. And this is just one more case for that particular route. I will say, though, that this doesn't take away from people wanting an SSHD or an SSD internally and increasing the boot time of their system itself. I still highly recommend that if you are going to do this upgrade at all, that you just use 1 terabyte or a 2 terabyte SSHD, the FireCuda that Seagate makes. I've seen in my testing, I've seen speeds with those that are on par with SSDs. And they're much, much cheaper than SSDs. They only will run you maybe $10 or more than the equivalent HDD, and you get a lot more speed out of them. The equivalent SSD at the 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte range is as much as, I'd say, 4 times as much, maybe even more than that. So the SSHD, unless money's no object, then SSD is always a better way to go. But if money is certainly an issue here, or you're trying to get the most performance for your money, the SSHD is the way to go. Okay, guys. So one of my next videos, I have tons of footage that I've been filming over the last few months. And I've just been really bogged down with my daily schedule and some of my other jobs. And just lately, every aspect of my life has been very busy. So I have all this footage. I just need to take the time and edit everything together. And as soon as I do that, I'll have some more videos coming out. But again, I apologize for if I've misled anyone with the larger than 2 terabyte drive size. But I'll be trying to clarify it more and more in the future and in future videos. All right, so until my next video, I'll see you guys later.